They sold her while she was still bleeding. Not hours after, not days, while the blood was still warm on the straw beneath her. A woman who had just survived something that kills half the women who attempt it. And the men standing around her were already arguing over her price. Her baby was gone. Taken before she could count his fingers. Before she could learn the color of his eyes. Before she could even say his name out loud. And the only person who stepped forward, the only soul in that frozen, godforsaken settlement, was the man everyone in 3 counties feared most. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about survival. Chapter 1. Clearwater Hollow, Wyoming Territory. November 1874. The snow had been falling since Tuesday. By Thursday morning, it sat 2 feet deep against the walls of Mabel Greer's boarding house, and the wind off the Absaroka Range had turned mean, the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it settled, working its way through layers of wool and skin until it found the marrow of your bones and made a home there. Inside the small back room that Mabel rented to travelers who couldn't afford the nicer establishments, which, in Clearwater Hollow, meant anyone who wasn't affiliated with the Harlan Syndicate, a 23-year-old woman named Elira Vance had been laboring since before midnight. She had no husband in the room, no mother, no midwife with clean hands and warm voice. What she had was Mabel herself, a stout, gray-haired woman who'd delivered enough babies in her 62 years to know when something was going wrong, and a 14-year-old girl named Cora who served the tables downstairs and had been conscripted into service because she happened to be nearby when Elira's water broke. "Don't push yet," Mabel said. Her voice was flat with the particular calm of someone who had learned through repetition not to let fear show. "I mean it, Elira. Not yet." "I can't." Elira's voice tore apart mid-sentence. Her hands were white around the iron headboard. Her dark hair was plastered to her face in ropes of sweat, and her gray eyes, her one genuinely striking feature, the kind of pale silver gray that made strangers do a double-take, were wild with something past pain, past fear. Something that lived in the basement of the human mind and only came out when the body truly believed it was dying. "You can," Mabel said. "You're going to, and then it's going to be over, and you're going to breathe." Cora stood near the wall, holding a lantern, her young face the color of old candle wax. She wasn't watching Elira. She was watching the door, as though she expected something to come through it, which, as it happened, was not an unreasonable instinct. The baby came just before 4 in the morning. He was small, smaller than Mabel liked, but he came into the world breathing and making noise, which was the primary requirement as far as Mabel was concerned. She cleaned him quickly, efficiently, wrapping him in the one clean piece of linen she'd thought to bring. Elira had stopped screaming by then. She lay still against the straw mattress, her chest heaving with the particular exhaustion that has no name because no language has found adequate words for it. The exhaustion of a body that has used every reserve it possesses and is now simply waiting to find out if there is anything left. She turned her head toward the sound. Her baby was crying. Small, jagged, furious little sounds. Mabel was wrapping him, moving toward her. The door opened. Not knocked, opened. 3 men came in, and they did it with the easy authority of men who had never once in their lives considered that a closed door might require their permission to enter. The first was Donner Kraus, a wide-shouldered, flat-faced man who ran the trading post at the edge of town and served as the Harlan Syndicate's local representative in all matters commercial and otherwise. He wore a beaverskin coat and an expression of mild inconvenience. The way a man looks when he has an errand to run in weather he doesn't care for. Behind him stood 2 men Elira didn't know by name, though she recognized their type. Hired weight. Men who existed to make other men's intentions physical. "Kraus?" Mabel's voice had gone from flat to iron. "You get out of this room." "Mind yourself, Mabel." Kraus's gaze moved past her to the bed, to Elira, to the wrapped bundle in Mabel's arms. Something calculated crossed his face. Not warmth, not curiosity. Arithmetic. "She's still alive?" "Get out. I'm asking a civil question." He stepped further into the room. One of the men behind him moved to the side, positioning himself between Mabel and the door without making it look deliberate. "She came into this town with debt attached. That debt don't pause for babies." Elira had pushed herself up onto her elbows. Every muscle in her body screamed at the movement. "Where's Thomas?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He was supposed to be here. Thomas Vance, Your husband skipped out 2 days ago, Kraus said. Not unkindly, exactly, but with the complete absence of any emotion that could be confused for kindness. Took what cash was left and rode south, left his tab with us, and, well, his eyes moved to her. Whatever else he left behind. Silence in the room except for the wind and the baby's thin crying. I don't have anything, Elira said. I don't have money. I don't have... No, Kraus agreed. You don't. He nodded at one of the men behind him. Take the child. Mabel moved. She was 62 and stout and not built for speed, but she moved with a fierce instinct, turning her body to block. And the second man caught her by the arm and held her still with a kind of practiced bored efficiency, the way you'd hold a door against wind. Don't you... Mabel's voice cracked. That is a newborn child, Donner Kraus. That child is minutes old. The child is an asset, Kraus said. Babies fetch a fair price from certain buyers down south. People who can't have their own. It's not what you're making it sound like, Mabel. The baby is better off than... Give him to me. Elira was trying to get up. Her legs were giving out underneath her. She could feel the blood. She was still bleeding, badly, and she knew it. Some clinical part of her brain registering information while the rest of her simply refused to accept any reality in which that bundle was leaving the room without her. Please, I'll work, I'll do anything, I'll pay back whatever Thomas owed, just... The man took the baby from Mabel. Mabel let out a sound that didn't belong in a human throat. Cora, near the wall, pressed herself flat against it and closed her eyes. Elira's knees hit the floor. She hadn't meant to fall. Her body just stopped supporting the decision to stand. She reached out. She was reaching toward nothing, toward a man's back, toward a doorway, toward the sound of her baby's crying getting further away, and her hands found only cold plank floor. Get her cleaned up, Kraus said, to no one in particular on his way out the door. She'll be sold in the morning, traders coming through from Billings, they'll take her. The door closed. Mabel was on her knees beside Elira on the floor. She was saying something. Elira could see her mouth moving, could feel the woman's arms around her. But the sound had gone strange and distant, like hearing someone call your name from the far side of a canyon. The baby was gone. Her body was failing. The morning was coming. Chapter 2. The Trading Dawn. In Clearwater Hollow came slow and gray, filtered through cloud cover so thick the sun never really arrived, just a gradual lightening of the dark that passed for morning in November. The trading happened in the yard behind the stable, where 3 men from Billings had set up a makeshift operation that anyone passing through would have been forgiven for not immediately recognizing as what it was. They had a wagon. They had paperwork. Real-looking paperwork, ledgers and receipts, the bureaucratic camouflage of commerce. Elira stood between 2 of Kraus's men in the yard, wearing her own clothes because no one had thought to provide her with better. She had gotten to her feet through a combination of Mabel's help, a length of cloth wrapped tight around her midsection, and the particular ferocious stubbornness that some people are simply born with and cannot explain. She was still bleeding. She knew she might be bleeding in a way that would kill her before nightfall. She had decided, somewhere on the floor of Mabel's back room, that this was not an excuse to lie down. If she was going to die, she was going to die on her feet. She stood straight. Her legs shook. She did not let anyone see them shaking. There were perhaps 24 people in the yard, and at its edges, the residents of Clearwater Hollow going about their morning or pretending to in the way of small communities everywhere. Watching without watching, knowing without knowing. The collective fiction of people who have learned that seeing things clearly carries costs they cannot afford. Kraus was talking to the lead trader, a lean man named Pell, who had a permanently pleasant expression that Elira had immediately categorized as the most dangerous kind of face, the kind that made violence look reasonable. She's young, Pell said. He was looking at her the way a man at a livestock auction looks at a horse, measuring, calculating, entirely impersonal. But she's just whelped. That's a complication. She's strong, Kraus said. Look at her. Woman gave birth last night and she's standing in the cold without help. I can see that. Pell walked a slow circle around her. Elira kept her eyes forward. What are you asking? Enough to cover the debt and transport. I'll give you 40. The debt is 60. Then you should have picked a better debtor, Donner. Pell stopped in front of her. He was maybe 3 inches taller than she was, and he had the habit of standing too close, which she suspected was deliberate. 50. Final. Kraus exhaled through his nose, a small, defeated sound. Fine. Somewhere behind her, Illyra heard one of the watching townspeople cough. She heard another murmur something to his companion. She heard no one say stop. No one say wait. No one say the obvious thing that all of them had to be thinking, which was that this was happening in the open, in their town, to a woman who had given birth hours ago. She had stopped expecting anything from these people approximately 45 minutes ago. Pell reached into his coat for the money. "I'll give you 70. The voice came from the left, and it came quiet. Not raised to carry, just a flat statement, the way you'd quote a price at a store counter. But the yard went still in the particular way yards go still when a certain kind of man speaks. Illyra turned her head. He was standing at the edge of the stable, maybe 12 feet away, and he was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his hat low enough that she couldn't see his eyes at first. He was tall, not exceptionally, but built in a way that suggested substance. A dark canvas coat, trail-worn. A gun on his hip that he wasn't touching. He had a few days of dark beard and a jaw that had clearly been broken at least once in his life and set crooked. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Pell. "Rhett Calder," someone in the crowd said, under their breath, with exactly the tone of voice you'd use to say rattlesnake. Pell's pleasant expression tightened at the edges. "This isn't your business, Calder. Made it my business." Rhett Calder pushed off the wall and walked into the center of the yard, and the crowd parted for him. Not dramatically, not with obvious hurry, but steadily, the way water moves around a stone in a stream. 70. Cash. Kraus was staring at him. "You're buying—" "I'm making a better offer than this man." He finally looked at Illyra then, and she got a look at his eyes. Dark brown, close set, utterly unreadable. He looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds, with the same impersonal assessment that Pell had used, but somehow entirely different in character. Like a man checking whether a window was broken rather than whether a thing was valuable. Then he looked back at Kraus. "Do you want $70 or not? What for?" Pell's pleasant voice had developed an edge. "What do you want with her, Calder?" "My business." "Now hold on." Kraus was looking between them. Money was fighting instinct behind his eyes, and money was winning, as it generally did with Kraus. "Pell, You take his money," Pell said flatly. "And we're done doing business." A moment. The snow was still falling, slow and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. 75, Rhett said, "and I'm getting bored." Kraus took the money. Pell stared at Calder with the particular expression of a man who is doing the mathematics of violence and arriving at an answer he doesn't like. Then he walked to his wagon without another word, climbed up, and drove it out of the yard at a pace that was careful not to look like retreat. The crowd in the yard remained. Nobody spoke. Rhett Calder turned and looked at Illyra again. She looked back at him. "You got anything here?" he said. "Belongings?" Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. "A bag. In Mabel's room." "Get it." He was already turning toward the stable. "Meet me out front in 10 minutes. "Wait." She took a step toward him, and her leg nearly gave. She stopped it. "My son. Kraus sold my son last night to—" "I know." He said it without stopping, without turning around. She stared at his back. "You know?" He was already inside the stable. Chapter 3. The Road to Nowhere. "Good." Mabel tried to stop her. Not forcefully. She wasn't the kind of woman who tried to control others once they'd made their minds up. But she stood in the doorway of the back room while Illyra pulled on a second wool skirt and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and she said what she felt she had to say. "Illyra, that man is not safe." "I know. He's killed people. More than one. I'm not saying it the way people say things in this town as gossip. I am telling you he has killed people and nobody did a thing about it because there's nobody here to do a thing about it." "I know." Illyra pulled the bag from under the bed. It wasn't much. A change of clothes, a small knife she'd had since she was 15, $20 that Thomas hadn't found. She straightened up slowly, pressing one hand to the wall. "Mabel." "What?" "The men who took my son. Kraus said buyers from the south. People who can't have children." She heard her own voice say the words, and they still didn't make sense. They still didn't fit together into anything she could hold. "Do you know who?" Mabel's face did something complicated. "There's talk. The Harlan Syndicate, They've been doing more than cattle for the last few years. Moving people. Children, especially. Her voice had gone very quiet. There was a family last spring, the Nortons, their little girl. Where do they take them? Bush south. That's all anyone knows for certain. The Dakotas first, then Mabel stopped. Alira, even if Calder is sincere, even if he actually intends to help you find the boy, and I cannot imagine why he would, the syndicate is not a group of men you can go up against. They have judges, town marshals, half the territory is in their pocket. Alira looked at her. My son is alive, she said. He was alive when they took him. That means there's time. She picked up her bag. The man outside is the only person in this entire town who offered me anything. I'm going with him. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she went to her bureau, opened the top drawer, and came back with a small paper-wrapped parcel. Food for the road. There's dried meat and hardtack. She pressed it into Alira's hands and then held on. Her eyes were red at the rims. You send word when you can. I will. And Alira. Mabel's grip tightened briefly. You're tougher than you know. You always were, from the moment you walked into this town. Don't let anyone, including that man, make you forget that. Alira nodded. She didn't trust her voice to hold. She went out through the front door into the snow. Rhett Calder had a horse, a Grula gelding, heavy-built, the kind of animal that prioritized endurance over beauty, and a pack mule loaded with supplies. He was checking the mule's cinch when Alira came out of the boarding house. He glanced at her once, noted the bag, noted the way she was walking. You're bleeding, he said. I'm aware. Bad? She considered lying. Possibly. He looked at her for a moment with the same unreadable expression. There's a settlement 40 miles north. Trapper named Hollenbeck lives there. His wife was a medicine woman, Crow. She knows what she's doing. And you're taking me there. That's where I'm going. She looked at the horse and the mule and the gray, empty road leading north out of Clearwater Hollow. Then she looked back at him. You know about my son, she said. You said that. I know, you said. So tell me what you know. He finished with the cinch. He didn't look at her. The child was taken last night before you delivered, based on what Kraus had already arranged. Sold to a buyer who works for the Harlan Syndicate's acquisition arm. The buyer's name is Sutter. He runs a distribution operation out of a trading post on the South Fork. Routes children south and west to buyers who pay well and don't ask questions. He said it all in the same flat, informational tone. Sutter won't move the child for at least a week, maybe 10 days. Babies need time to travel safely or they don't arrive in sellable condition. Sellable condition. Alira's stomach turned. She breathed through her nose and kept her face neutral. How do you know that? She asked. Rhett finally looked at her. Because I've been trying to find Sutter for 8 months. She waited. He didn't volunteer more. Why? She said. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not much, a shadow crossing a shadow. And then it was gone, and the blankness returned. Get on the horse, he said. We're burning daylight. She wanted to push it. She made a decision not to, which took more effort than it sounds like, because she had a quality that had caused her trouble her entire life. The inability to leave a question unanswered, a tendency to pull at threads until she either understood the whole cloth or unraveled it completely. She got on the horse. It took all the strength she had left, and she used the stirrup and the saddle horn in sheer bloody-minded will to get herself up and settled. And she sat straight once she was there, spine long, chin level, the way her mother had always told her a woman should ride. Like you own the ground beneath you, not like you're grateful for it. Rhett took the mule's lead in one hand and started walking without fanfare, without ceremony, without a single backwards glance at the town they were leaving. Alira looked back once. Clearwater Hollow sat in the bowl of its valley like something the landscape had coughed up and forgotten. A few dozen buildings, gray wood gone silver in the cold. Smoke from morning fires. A handful of people visible on the main street who turned to watch them go. She faced forward. She did not cry. She would not. Not yet. Find him first, she told herself. Find him first and then you can fall apart. Not before. Chapter 4. 40 miles. The day was brutal. The trail north was not a road so much as a suggestion made by previous travelers, a vague impression through the pines that filled with snow as fast as horses cleared it. The wind came in sideways off the ridge, and within 2 hours Alira couldn't feel her feet, which was both a problem and a mild relief because it meant the foot pain wasn't competing with everything else. She didn't talk. Rhett didn't talk. This suited them both. He walked the whole way. She realized after a while that he'd put her on his horse and taken the mule himself, and that this was a deliberate decision he'd made without announcing it, without asking her if she needed it. She found she had complicated feelings about this. On one hand, she was grateful in the practical, unromantic way that people are grateful for things that keep them alive. On the other hand, she was acutely aware that she knew nothing about this man, that she was bleeding into a cloth wrapped around her midsection in the wilderness with a stranger, that the whole framework of her life had collapsed in the space of about 8 hours, and she was now entirely dependent on a person she'd met roughly 4 hours ago, and who had, she could not forget, purchased her like livestock. She turned this over in her mind as the hours went by. The horse moved steadily beneath her. Rhett moved ahead, leading the mule through the deepening snow. He didn't struggle with it. He moved like a man who had spent the better part of his life in this exact kind of weather and had long since stopped having opinions about it. Around midday he stopped, tied the mule to a branch, and came back to where she sat on the horse. "Get down," he said. 10 minutes. Horse needs a rest." She got down. Her legs reported that they were not particularly happy about this development, and her body made a brief, urgent case for sitting down on the nearest log and not getting up. She overruled it. He handed her a canteen. She drank. The water was cold enough to hurt. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He was looking at the trail ahead. "You're going to regardless." "Fair. What do you want from this?" He looked at her then. "What?" "You bought me. You're taking me north. You say you're looking for Sutter." She kept her voice level. I'm grateful. I mean that. But I'm not in a position where I can afford not to understand what this is." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want anything from you," he said. The flat tone again, but something slightly different in it. Something that sounded almost like he was choosing words carefully, which seemed unlikely, given that he appeared to use as few words as possible at all times. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now. Try harder." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that might have been surprise, or the closest approximation to it that his face could manage. "You're in no condition to be this stubborn." "I'm always in condition to be this stubborn." She handed the canteen back. "You paid for me. That means you own me in the eyes of every person who watched that transaction. I need to know what you think you bought." The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I bought time," he said. "Pell would have had you 50 miles south before nightfall. You'd have been in a place I couldn't reach you. Finding Sutter through you, through what you know about how your boy was taken, the specific men involved, the timing, is faster than the way I've been going about it." It was honest. She appreciated honest more than she appreciated comfortable. "So I'm useful to you," she said. "Yes." "And when you find Sutter?" "That's my business." "My son is at the end of this, Calder. That makes it my business too." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. "Get back on the horse," he said. "We're burning time." She got back on the horse, but she'd noticed the thing his expression had done, and she filed it away, the way she filed everything away. A habit formed by years of living with a man she couldn't trust, of reading rooms and faces and silences for information that wasn't being volunteered. He wasn't telling her everything. That didn't mean he was lying. The difference mattered. Chapter 5. The Hollenbeck Place. They arrived at dark. The settlement, calling it a settlement was generous. It was 3 structures and a smokehouse, sat in a narrow valley between 2 ridge lines, protected from the worst of the wind by the geography. Light leaked from the largest building's window, a warm amber against the blue-gray dark. Rhett's knock was answered by a man in his 60s, Hollenbeck, Illyra assumed, with a white beard and the permanently squinted expression of someone who'd spent decades in mountain light. He looked at Rhett, then at Alira, then at the dark stains on Alira's skirt that the cold and the dark hadn't quite hidden. "Who is she?" he said. "Her name is Alira," Rhett said. "She delivered last night. She needs Maka." Hollenbeck looked at her more closely. "Last night? And she's been on a horse for—" "I didn't have a choice in the matter," Alira said, pleasantly. Hollenbeck blinked. Then he stepped back and pulled the door wide. "Maka," he called into the interior. "Got a woman here needs you. The woman who came from the back room was perhaps 40, Crow, with gray in her black hair and hands that moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had managed crises before and had developed a professional relationship with them. She looked at Alira once, assessed, and said to Hollenbeck in a tone that left no room for argument, "Get the fire up, get water heating, get the men out of this room." The men left the room. Micah sat Alira down, began unwrapping the cloth around her midsection, and worked in a quiet that was different from Rhett's quiet, purposeful and warm, the silence of someone paying full attention. "Bad?" Alira asked. "You've been lucky," Micah said, which was not the same as no. "It's slowing. Your body is handling it." She pressed carefully around Alira's midsection, and Alira kept her face still through the pain of it. "You'll need to stay still, 2 days at minimum." "I can't. 2 days." Micah looked at her with dark, level eyes. "Or you'll bleed out in the snow on day 3. That won't help your son." Alira's mouth closed. "Rhett told you." "He told Hollenbeck. Sound carries." Micah continued her work. "How old is he?" "Hours." The word came out rougher than she intended. Micah paused, just for a moment. Her hands, for one brief instant, were still. "Then he's strong," she said. "He made it through, which means he wants to be here." She resumed working. "What's his name?" Alira opened her mouth. She hadn't named him. He'd been taken before she'd named him. She'd had a name ready, had carried it for months, had said it to herself in quiet moments, turning it over. And she hadn't gotten to use it. "Nate," she said. She heard the word and it felt right, felt like something landing where it was supposed to land. "His name is Nate." Micah nodded once, as though this settled something. 2 days, Alira, she said. Then you can chase the world down. Chapter 6. Night at the Settlement. Later, with the fire built high, and Alira lying in a bed that smelled of pine and herbs and something faintly smoky, she heard the men talking in the next room. Not arguing. Talking. The low, functional talk of men discussing something concrete. She should sleep. Her body was a chorus of demands. Sleep was the loudest one. She lay still and listened. Sutter's operation, Hollenbeck. I know you've heard things. I've heard plenty. Hollenbeck's voice was cautious. And I've stayed out of it deliberately. Man has friends in places that make trouble for people who make trouble. I know where he's based, Rhett said. South Fork. But he'll have moved by the time we can get there. Then what are you... I need the relay point between the South Fork post and wherever he's taking the children south. There's a place... I know there's a stop somewhere in the middle, somewhere they hold the cargo while they arrange the next leg. I need to know where. A long pause. Rhett. Hollenbeck's voice had changed. What happened to you happened a long time ago, and I understood why you did what you did after, but this... Tell me where the relay point is. Another pause. Longer. I've heard it's near Bitter Creek, Hollenbeck said, finally. Old fort the trappers used to use. Been abandoned official-like for years, but Sutter's men have been seen in that area. A creak of chair. But, Rhett, if you go in there without backup, without... I'll have what I need. Alira lay in the dark and turned this over. What happened to you happened a long time ago. She didn't know what that meant. She was fairly sure she would find out, eventually, whether she wanted to or not. She closed her eyes. Sleep took her faster than she expected, dragged her down into somewhere deep and dreamless, the way extreme exhaustion can be its own mercy. And her last conscious thought was not of Thomas, who had left her, or of Clearwater Hollow, which had watched her sold in its yard, or of the cold or the blood, or the endless gray sky. It was of Nate, his voice, those small, furious sounds in the minutes before he was taken. The way a person can know someone for only minutes and still be entirely certain they would set the world on fire for them. 2 days, she thought, and then she slept. Chapter 7. Morning and Truth. She woke to gray light and the smell of wood smoke and something being cooked. Salt pork, she thought, and her body's response to this information was embarrassingly immediate. She sat up slowly. Everything hurt. But it was organized hurt, the kind with a source and a reason, not the diffuse, terrifying wrongness of the night before. The bleeding had slowed significantly. Micah had left clean cloth on the chair beside the bed, and Alira changed herself and dressed with methodical care. She came out into the main room. Rhett was at the table eating. He looked up when she came in, assessed, and returned to his food. Maka was at the fire. Hollenbeck was nowhere visible. Sit, Maka said. Eat. Illyra sat. Food appeared in front of her, and she ate it without ceremony or conversation, because her body had opinions about priorities, and they did not include small talk. When she'd finished, she wrapped both hands around a tin cup of something hot that wasn't quite coffee and looked at Rhett. Bitter Creek, she said. He looked up. Sound carries, she said. You mentioned it last night. His jaw tightened briefly, then released. Yeah. Is that where we're going? It's where I'm going. My son is there. If Hollenbeck's information is right, which isn't certain, then it's where we're both going. She watched his face. I know what you're thinking, that I'll slow you down, that I'm a liability. She set down the cup. You're wrong. I know these men, Kraus, the men who work for him, better than you do. I know what they told Thomas, what they offered him, the arrangement they had. I know things you don't have. You've been in this territory for what, 3 months? 4. And I've been married to a man who owed money to half the criminals between here and the Dakotas. You pick things up. She kept her eyes steady on him. I'm not asking you to carry me. I'm asking you to let me come. Rhett looked at his coffee cup, then at his hands, then at her. 2 days, he said, like Maka said. She started to object. 2 days won't lose it, he said. Sutter holds the cargo for a week minimum. I told you that. We've got time if we don't waste it. He pushed back from the table. You rest. I'm going to talk to Hollenbeck about the layout of that fort. He left the room. Illyra watched him go. Maka sat down across from her with her own cup. The older woman looked at her with those level, dark eyes, and there was something in her expression that wasn't pity. Illyra would have recognized pity and resented it, but something more like recognition, like looking at a reflection you've seen before. He found a boy once, Maka said quietly. 3 years ago, traveling through here after one of Sutter's operations. A child, maybe 4 years old, left behind when things went wrong. Sick. Alone. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Rhett brought him here, stayed with him until he was well, spent 2 months trying to find where the boy had come from, who his people were. Illyra waited. He found them, Maka said. The family. Way down in Colorado. Brought the boy back. She paused. But he'd seen enough by then. What Sutter did. What happened to the ones who didn't get left behind. Her voice was even and careful, the way you carry something fragile. He's been looking for Sutter since. 8 months, like he said. Illyra sat with this. He told me it was because I was useful, she said. Information. That's probably partly true. Maka looked at her cup. Rhett doesn't do things for simple reasons. He also doesn't explain himself. I noticed. You pushed him yesterday, on the trail. Maka's eyes came up. He told Hollenbeck about it this morning. He was... She paused again, choosing her word. Surprised, I think, that you pushed. A small sound that might have been amusement. Most people don't. Illyra looked toward the door Rhett had gone through. Useful is fine, she said. I'm useful. That's a transaction I understand. She picked up her cup again. I just needed to know it wasn't something else. Maka nodded, once, slowly, with the look of someone who understood exactly what something else meant and why it mattered that it not be that. Outside, the snow had stopped. In the pine branches above the settlement, something, a bird, a raven, maybe, called once, sharp and clear, and then went silent. Illyra drank her coffee. 2 days. Nate was out there somewhere, warm and breathing and waiting. 2 days, she told herself, and then we come for you. The 2 days passed the way hard time always does. Not slowly, exactly, but heavily, each hour carrying more than its share. Illyra slept more than she wanted to, and less than she needed to. She lay in the pine-scented room at Hollenbeck's and stared at the ceiling and made herself breathe and made herself rest, and told herself she was doing the only thing she could do, which was true, and which helped almost not at all. Somewhere south of here, her son was in the hands of people who saw him as inventory. Every hour she lay still was an hour she wasn't moving toward him. She knew the mathematics were on her side, Sutter's timeline, the week Rhett had described, but knowing a thing rationally and making peace with it are not the same operation, and she'd never been particularly good at making peace with anything. On the morning of the second day, Maka examined her, pressed her hands in several places that made Alira's vision go briefly white, and then sat back with the measured look of someone delivering a verdict they've already reached. "You're not healed," she said. "You're stable. There's a difference." "I know the difference. You need to not ride hard. Rest when you stop. If the bleeding comes back heavy, I'll stop." Maka looked at her for a moment with those dark, level eyes that seemed constitutionally incapable of pretending. "No, you won't," she said, "but at least know that you should." She stood and handed Alira a cloth pouch that smelled of dried herbs and something sharper, medicinal. Yarrow and red root. "If you bleed through, pack it. It'll slow things." She paused. "It's not a cure. It's time." "Time is what I need. Time is what we all need," Maka said, which wasn't quite agreement, but was the closest she appeared willing to get. Rhett was in the yard when Alira came out with her bag. He had the horses ready. Both of them, she noticed, saddled. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her before, that quick, impersonal once-over that somehow managed to be more genuinely attentive than most people's long stares. "You'll ride," he said. "No argument." "I wasn't going to argue." He looked mildly skeptical but said nothing. Hollenbeck came out to see them off. He shook Rhett's hand, held it a beat longer than a normal handshake, and something moved between the two men that didn't need words. The kind of communication that happens between people who've known each other long enough that language has become optional. Then he turned to Alira and handed her a folded piece of oilskin. "Map of the Bitter Creek area," he said, "or what I know of it. The fort's not marked on any official survey. They built it before the territory was organized, but I drew in the approach trails from memory." He tapped the paper. "The east approach is what Sutter's men use. Has a guard station about a half-mile out. You'd want the North Ridge if you're going in quiet." "Thank you," Alira said. Hollenbeck nodded. He looked like a man who wanted to say more and had decided against it. "Maka says your boy's name is Nate." She wasn't expecting that. "Yes." "Good name." He stepped back. "Bring him home." She put the map in her coat and got on the horse without help. They rode north for the first mile before Rhett turned them east, cutting through a gap in the ridge that he clearly knew from memory because there was nothing visible to distinguish it from the surrounding tree line. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the cold had the particular dry, crystalline quality of high elevation in late November, the kind that didn't feel brutal at first and then suddenly revealed that it had been killing you gently the whole time. They rode for a while in the silence they'd established on the first day, which by now had developed its own texture. Not uncomfortable, not warm, just functional. The silence of two people who have agreed, without discussion, that they have more important things to spend energy on than filling air. It was Rhett who broke it. "I need to tell you something," he said, not looking at her, eyes on the trail ahead. "About Sutter, about what you're riding into." She waited. "The ford at Bitter Creek, it's not just a relay point. It's where he does his accounting." He paused, and she got the sense he was choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. The children aren't held there long. A few days, sometimes less. But during that time, there are records, ledgers. Who was brought in, who bought them, where they're going. His jaw moved. "If your son has already been moved on, he hasn't. Alira, the timeline you gave me. He hasn't been moved." She said it with a certainty that was more decision than knowledge, because sometimes you have to commit to a thing before the evidence catches up. "But you're telling me about the ledgers for a reason." "If we get in there and he's gone," Rhett said quietly, "the ledger tells us where. It's not over if he's been moved. It just changes what we do next." She absorbed this. The trail wound through a narrow cut between two rock faces, close enough that snow fell from the overhang as they passed and dusted her shoulders. "You've been to that fort before," she said. "A beat." "Once. When you were looking for Sutter. When I was getting close enough to understand what I was dealing with." His voice stayed flat, but there was something beneath the flatness. Not quite bitterness, more like a weight that had been carried so long it had become structural. "I pulled back. Wrong time, wrong numbers." "How many men does he run?" "At the fort? Depends. Skeleton crew normally. 4, 5. When there's cargo being held, more. Could be 8, 10. She thought about this arithmetic carefully. "And it'll just be the two of us. Unless you know someone else in this territory who'd ride against the Harlan Syndicate." She didn't. She very much did not. "I can shoot," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I grew up in eastern Ohio," she said. My father had a farm and 2 daughters and no sons and a very pragmatic attitude about it. I've been shooting since I was 10. She paused. I'm not good at everything. I'm good at that. He returned his eyes to the trail. What can't you do? The question surprised her slightly. Ride like you do. Track. Build a fire in the wet. She thought about it honestly. I don't know this country, the landscape, the weather patterns. You have 20 years of knowledge I don't have. Fair. Is that enough for you to let me in on this? He was quiet for longer than she liked. You're already in on it. You don't have anywhere else to be. He shifted the mule's lead to his other hand. The question isn't whether I let you in, it's whether we can work together without getting each other killed. I follow direction when the direction makes sense. And when it doesn't, then I tell you it doesn't make sense, and we figure something out. She looked at his profile. I'm not going to pretend to be obedient to make you more comfortable, but I'm also not reckless. I have a son to find. Reckless doesn't serve him. Another long pause. Okay, Rhett said. Just that. Okay. Like she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. They rode on. The day wore toward afternoon, the light going thin and slanted through the pines. They stopped at a frozen creek to water the horses, and Alira got down carefully and stood for a moment with her hand pressed flat against her horse's warm neck, just breathing, letting the specific, uncomplicated warmth of the animal steady something in her chest that had been shaking loose all day. The horse turned its head and exhaled through its nose against her arm, which she found unreasonably comforting. Rhett was crouched at the creek's edge, checking the ice thickness before letting the horses near it. He moved with a particular economy that she'd been cataloging without entirely meaning to. Nothing performed, nothing wasted, every motion the exact size it needed to be. It was the opposite of the way Thomas had moved, always a little too much, always a gesture aimed outward at some imagined audience. She pushed Thomas out of her mind. He'd had his moment in the story and spent it badly, and she had no more use for him as a subject of thought. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked up from the ice. What Hollenbeck said the other night. What happened to you? What did he mean? The creek moved sluggishly under its skin of ice. Somewhere in the trees, wind moved through the upper branches without reaching the ground. Rhett stood up. He was quiet for long enough that she expected him to deflect, to do the same thing he'd done on the trail the first day, give her a flat my business, and move on. And she'd decided she'd accept that if he did, because she'd extracted everything she strictly needed, and the rest was his to keep. I had a daughter, he said. The creek, the wind, the horses shifting. She was 2. He said it looking at the ice, not at her. Her mother, we weren't married. She passed the winter Lily was born. So it was just the 2 of us, on the ranch. He stopped, started again, slower. I came back from a supply run to Billings. 3 days. I'd left Lily with a woman in the nearest settlement, a family I trusted. His voice hadn't changed in pitch or speed, but there was something in it now like a room from which all the air has been removed. She was gone when I came back. The woman, she didn't know anything, or said she didn't. Lily was just gone. A brief pause. That was 4 years ago. A brief pause. That was 4. Alira stood very still. Sutter, she said. I didn't know that name for 2 years, but yes. He turned from the creek and looked at her then, and his face was exactly as unreadable as always, which she now understood was not the absence of feeling but the architecture of a man who'd had to build walls in specific places to remain functional. She'd be 6 now. Have you found any? No. Flat and final. No trace. Nothing in any ledger I've gotten access to. Which is why the fort matters. He walked to his horse. The fort's records go back years. Everything Sutter moved. If Lily was... He stopped, adjusted the bridle with more precision than it required. If there's anything, it'll be there. She understood now what this was, what it had always been. Not just information, not just utility. This was a man who had been spending 4 years looking for a splinter of hope in the dark, and she had arrived in Clearwater Hollow at the exact moment when he finally had a reason to go through that fort's front door. She was his leverage, he was her pathway. That was the honest shape of it. She should have found this purely transactional. She did find it transactional. She also found it something else, something she didn't have an exact word for, the feeling of recognizing in another person a specific flavor of grief that you understand on a cellular level because you're currently living inside your own version of it. She got back on the horse without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that would be worth the saying. After a moment, Rhett mounted, and they rode on. They made camp that evening in a stand of spruce that blocked the worst of the wind, and Rhett built a fire with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it in wet cold for decades. Not a big fire, nothing that would carry far, just enough to be useful. He cooked salt pork and hardtack without ceremony, and they ate beside the small fire in a silence that had shifted again, taken on a new quality. Not comfortable, exactly, but honest. The silence of people who have told each other real things and not yet figured out what to do with them. The approach, Illyra said when she'd finished eating. She had the oilskin map spread across her knee, tilted toward the firelight. Hollenbeck said North Ridge for the quiet way in. Rhett leaned over to look. He pointed with one finger. Here. This gap. It's a longer approach. Adds 2 hours. But it puts us above the fort, which is where you want to be. When do we arrive? We'll camp about 6 miles out tomorrow night. Go in the following morning, early. He looked at her. Before dawn. When the night crew is at its worst and the day crew isn't alert yet. How do we find Nate in there? She kept her voice even. We can't exactly ask at the door. There'll be a holding area. Fort has an old storehouse on the east side. That's where I saw them keeping children when I was there before. He tapped the map. Secondary objective is the records room, which I believe is the main building, ground floor. He paused. We can't do both simultaneously. Yes, we can, she said. He looked at her. You're better at dealing with men who want to kill you, she said. I'll find Nate. You get to the records. She held his gaze. I know what my son looks like and sounds like. You don't. And you know how to handle what's going to happen when they realize someone is inside their fort. I don't. She folded the map. Division of labor. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire made small sounds between them. You'd be going in alone, he said. Yes. If something goes wrong, then something goes wrong. She tucked the map back into her coat. Rhett, I was sold in a yard 2 days after giving birth. Something already went wrong. I'm past waiting for conditions to be ideal. He looked at the fire. Don't get creative, he said finally. In and out. You find the boy, you get out. You don't engage anyone unless you have to. Agreed. If the holding area is empty, then I find the records room. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going to fall apart on you. I need you to believe that. He met her eyes. I believe it, he said. And the absence of any caveat, any qualification, any measurable hesitation that was worth more to her than a long speech would have been. She lay down with her coat over her and the hard ground under her back, and the fire burning low nearby, and she looked at the dark shape of the spruce branches against the night sky and thought about the distance between here and a storehouse at an abandoned fort near Bitter Creek, and the small, warm weight of a child she'd held for approximately 4 minutes before he was taken from her arms. She thought about what Maka had said. He made it through, which means he wants to be here. She held on to that. She closed her eyes, and the fire crackled, and somewhere on the other side of it, Rhett Calder lay in the cold and quiet, carrying his own load of 4 years, and neither of them slept particularly well, but both of them slept, which was, under the circumstances, exactly enough. They reached the 6-mile camp as the last light left the sky, and the cold that followed the dark was a different animal entirely from the daytime cold, sharper, with intent, the kind that makes you aware of every place your clothing gaps or thins. Rhett built the fire smaller than the night before. No ceremony about it, just a judgment call. They were close enough now that smoke and light mattered in a different way. He cooked nothing. They ate cold from the pack, dried meat, hardtack, a handful of dried apples that Maka had tucked in somewhere without announcing it. Illyra found them and held one in her palm for a moment before eating it, because the small, unexpected kindness of it caught her somewhere unguarded. She didn't say anything about it. She ate and looked at the map again, though she'd memorized it by now, and going over it was less about new information than about the need to do something with her hands while her mind worked. Guards, she said. You said 4 or 5 on a normal night, more when there's cargo. Right, Nate is cargo. She said it flat and factual because that was the only way to say it without it taking her legs out from under her. So we're looking at the higher number, probably. Rhett had his back against a spruce trunk, whittling nothing, just moving the knife to keep his hands busy. She'd noticed he did this when he was thinking. The east approach has a station a half-mile out. 1 man, maybe 2. We bypass that going in from the north, but it means they don't trip on us early, which cuts both ways. Meaning they're not alerted before we're inside. Meaning we don't know what's changed inside since I was last there. He looked at the knife. My information is 8 months old. Layout's probably the same. Personnel, arrangements? That's the unknown. Alira folded the map and looked at him directly. What aren't you telling me? He glanced up. There's something you've been working around all day, she said. I can see it. You get a certain look when you're deciding whether to say a thing. He was quiet for a moment in the way that she'd learned meant he was actually considering, not stonewalling. Last time I was near that fort, he said, I saw someone I recognized. He went back to the knife. Man named Cord Devers. He used to ride with me, years back, before I settled the ranch. She waited. He's working for Sutter now. Rhett's voice stayed even, but the knife stopped moving briefly. Which means if he sees me, he knows my face, knows how I operate. He'll know what I'm there for. He set the knife down. He's not someone who'll hesitate. Is he the kind of man who'd warn you, for the sake of having ridden together? Rhett looked at her with something close to bleak amusement. No. Then he's just an obstacle with a name. He picked the knife back up. That's one way to put it. She lay back and looked at the sky. Cloud cover tonight, no stars, no moon, just a solid dark ceiling that would help them tomorrow morning and made her feel slightly claustrophobic right now. She turned her mind to the practical because the practical was where she functioned best when everything else threatened to collapse into feeling. In and out. Find the holding area. Find Nate. Get out. Don't engage unless you have to. She repeated it until it had the texture of something solid. Her hand moved, without her deciding to move it, to the small knife on her belt. The one she'd had since she was 15, the one that had survived Thomas and the road and everything after. She wrapped her fingers around the handle and felt its familiar grip and left it there. She slept 3 hours. It was enough. They rose before the sky showed any change, dressed in the dark by feel, broke camp without fire or conversation. The horses were left tied and covered in a hollow a mile back. Rhett's decision and the right one. On foot they were slower but quieter, and the North Ridge approach was too steep for horses in this snow regardless. The ridge climb was hard. Alira didn't complain, and she didn't ask for help, and twice on the steeper sections, she slipped and caught herself and kept going. Her body had opinions. Forceful, detailed opinions about what it thought of being asked to climb a snow-covered ridge 4 days after childbirth. She noted them and filed them for later. The yarrow and red root pouch was in her coat pocket, which felt either like preparedness or like carrying your own bad omen, and she'd decided it was the former and wasn't revisiting the decision. Rhett moved ahead of her, setting steps in the snow where he could, holding back branches. Not making a production of it, just doing it. At the ridgetop they stopped, breathing hard, and Rhett went flat in the snow, and she did the same, and they lay there and looked down at the fort below. It was smaller than she'd pictured. Not small, but the word fort suggested something more imposing than what was there. A main building, 2 or 3 outbuildings, a stockade wall that was original to the trapper days and had gaps in it that nobody had bothered to repair, presumably because the location was remote enough that the wall was largely decorative. Firelight in 2 windows of the main building. A single lamp moving on what appeared to be a patrol circuit around the exterior. 1 visible guard on a patrol, which didn't mean 1 guard total. Storehouse, Rhett said under his breath close to her ear, pointing. The building on the far east side of the compound, set slightly apart from the main structure. No visible windows on this side. A door with a bar across it she could see even from here because the lamp on the patrolling guard swung toward it as he passed. That's where. She looked at it, memorized the distance from the gap in the north wall to the storehouse door. 40 feet, maybe 45. Open ground. The patrol passed every... She watched. Roughly 4 minutes. 4 minutes wasn't nothing. It also wasn't comfortable. Main building, Rhett said, shifting his attention. Records room will be ground floor, rear, there's a back entrance, small, used for deliveries. That's my way in. When do we go? He looked at the patrol, looked at the sky. 20 minutes. Patrol gets lazier as it gets closer to shift change. And that man, he indicated the walking lamp, has been taking longer on the south side every circuit. He's cold. He's standing near the south wall where the wind breaks. He's buying himself an extra 2 minutes of shelter every pass. She'd noticed it too. So we go when he's at the south wall. So we go when he's at the south wall. They lay in the snow and waited. The cold worked on her steadily. She focused on the storehouse door, on the bar across it, on the math of 45 feet. She thought about what sound a 6-day-old baby makes in a cold room, whether he was warm enough, whether someone inside had the basic human capacity to keep an infant alive even while treating him as merchandise. She didn't let herself go further than that. Rhett touched her arm. The patrol was moving south, slowing, drifting toward the shelter of the south wall. They went. The gap in the stockade was exactly where Hollenbeck's map had marked it, which made Alira feel a rush of gratitude toward the old trapper and his careful memory. They came through it in single file, crouched low, moving on the frozen ground that was quieter than the snow had been on the ridge. The cold had turned the surface to something between ice and hardpack, and it was treacherous underfoot but blessedly muffled. At the corner of the nearest outbuilding, Rhett stopped them with a hand gesture. Listened. The lamp was out of sight, south wall, as predicted. He looked at her. She nodded. He went right, angling toward the back of the main building, keeping low and close to the structures. Within seconds, the dark swallowed him. She went for the storehouse. The 45 feet felt like a mile. She covered it in a crouch, moving as fast as she could manage without sound, and the whole time the back of her neck was doing what the back of necks do when exposed and moving through open ground, a full-body conviction that someone was looking directly at her. She reached the storehouse wall and pressed herself against it and waited, heart doing something distracting in her chest. Nothing happened. She edged to the door. The bar was a heavy timber, set in iron brackets. She lifted it slowly. It was heavier than she'd expected, and she had to use both hands, and for 3 terrible seconds it scraped against one of the brackets with a sound that seemed, in the silence, enormous. She froze, counted 10 full seconds. The patrol lamp didn't reappear. She set the bar against the wall and pulled the door open an inch. Warm air hit her face, warmer than outside. Someone had a heat source in there, a brazier maybe, something. The smell was hay and animal and something sharper underneath that she recognized as unwashed human beings in a closed space. She pulled the door wider and went in. The interior was dark except for the glow from a small iron brazier in the far corner, barely more than coals, but enough warmth to make the room survivable, which she supposed was a minimum business requirement. Her eyes adjusted. Straw on the floor, 2 blankets against one wall occupied. She could see the shapes, older children, 4 or 5 years old maybe, asleep. A wooden crate near the brazier. She moved to the crate. He was in it. He was alive. He was wrapped in a piece of wool and sleeping the dense, oblivious sleep of the very new, his small face creased and red and entirely perfect in the coal glow, and Alira Vance, who had held herself together through 4 days of blood and cold and grief and forward motion on nothing but sheer will, went to her knees on that straw floor and pressed her hand over her own mouth and shook for approximately 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds. Then she picked him up. He stirred, shifted, made a small sound that was the precursor to crying, and she brought him to her chest and held him there. And he seemed to recognize something, warmth or heartbeat or smell, and the sound dissolved back into sleep before it became an alarm. She held him for a moment that she could not have measured. Then she became aware of the other children against the wall. 2 of them. One asleep, one, the older one, she realized now, a girl maybe 5 or 6, watching her with eyes that were fully open in the dark, awake and cautious, and perfectly silent in the practiced way of a child who has learned that making noise brings consequences. Alira looked at her. The girl didn't move. She was supposed to find Nate and get out. That was the plan. In and out. Don't engage unless you have to. She looked at the girl. "Can you walk?" she whispered. The girl stared at her. "I'm not one of them." Alira kept her voice barely above breath, one hand on Nate's back, keeping him still. "I'm leaving. Can you walk?" A long pause. Then the girl gave the smallest possible nod. "Wake the other one. Quiet as you know how." She looked at the door. "We're going to go out that door and move fast. You stay right with me. You understand?" Another nod. The girl turned and put her hand on the smaller child's shoulder. A boy, Alira saw now, maybe 3. And she woke him with a skill that only comes from practice. A firm hand, a look directly into his eyes before he had time to make sound, something whispered in his ear that settled him in seconds. He sat up silent. In the main building, through the walls in the distance, something happened. Voices, a shout, a bang that was probably a door. Then 2 more sounds in quick succession that were not a door, gunshots. Alira stood up. "Now," she said, no longer whispering. "Right now, both of you. Come on." The girl grabbed the boy's hand and they moved. Outside, the fort was no longer quiet. The patrol lamp had reappeared. Not south, not moving in its circuit, but swinging rapidly toward the main building in the direction of the noise. Another man was coming from the second outbuilding, shouting something she couldn't make out. She had the 2 children and an infant, and 45 feet of open ground, and a gap in the stockade wall that was about to have at least 2 armed men between her and it. She did not stop to calculate odds. She ran, not toward the gap on the north side, that was compromised now. The patrol was between her and it, but along the inside of the stockade wall, east, away from the main building and the gathering noise, toward the southeast corner where the wall had the largest gap she'd marked from the ridge. She hadn't planned to use it. Plans had apparently expired. The girl kept pace with her. Kept pace better than Alira expected, small legs moving fast and certain, holding the boy's hand with a grip that didn't slip. Alira had Nate against her chest with both arms, running in the half-dark along the wall, and she could hear behind her the sounds of the fort waking up into something that was not yet organized chaos but was headed there with conviction. The southeast gap was larger than the north one, old timber fallen away from the base, and she went through it sideways and came out into the open dark outside the fort and didn't stop. The ridge was behind her and to the left. The horses were a mile back. Between here and there was open, snowed ground and whatever was coming out of that fort once the men inside got themselves organized. She ran, or what passed for running. It was more of a controlled fall forward, one arm locked around Nate, the other hand grabbing the girl's free hand because the terrain was rough, and she wasn't going to lose these children to a snow-covered gully at this stage. The boy was making sounds now, not crying exactly, but close, and the girl said something to him in a low, fierce voice. Not English, something else. And he went quiet again. She ran until her lungs said they were done, and then she kept running. 100 yards from the fort, in a depression between 2 rises, she stopped and went flat, and pulled the children down with her, and lay listening. From the fort, voices, lantern light moving, but not coming this direction. Not yet. The commotion was still focused inward, on the main building, on whatever Rhett had started in there. She lay with her face in the snow and breathed. Nate shifted against her chest. She could feel his heartbeat, small and rapid and steady. She kept her hand on his back. "You're all right," she said to him, to the girl beside her, to herself. "We're outside, we're out." The girl was lying next to her, remarkably still, remarkably composed, and in the pale dark Alira could see her watching the fort behind them with an expression no child that age should have. Not fear exactly, but a vigilance so constant it had become the resting state of her face. Whatever this girl had been through to develop that expression, it had not happened in the last week. "What's your name?" Alira asked. She didn't answer immediately, then quiet. "Clara." "How long have you been here, Clara?" A pause. "I don't know. Long time." Alira looked at her, at the boy on Clara's other side. "Is he yours? Your brother?" "Yes." "What's his name?" "Eli." Eli. Alira almost said it, almost noted the coincidence of the names, but the timing seemed wrong, and also the universe had never particularly cared about the poetry of coincidence, so she let it sit. From the direction of the fort, 2 more gunshots. Then silence. Then silence for long enough that Alira started to feel it differently. Not as relief, but as a new kind of worry. Rhett should be coming. He'd go to the storehouse, find it empty, know she'd gotten out. He'd follow the tracks in the snow if he had to. The fresh marks of her run across the open ground were visible even in this dark. She watched the way she'd come. The dark sat still for a long, stretched minute. Then a shape came through it, moving fast, not running, but close, and she recognized the silhouette and the gait before she could see any detail. She let out a breath. Rhett dropped down beside her in the hollow. His coat was torn at the shoulder. He had something tucked under one arm. A ledger, thick and dark covered. And a look on his face that was the closest she'd yet seen to something cracked open. He saw Nate first, then he looked at her face. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The records?" she asked. He held up the ledger. "Devers?" "Not a problem anymore." He said it without weight, without detail, and she didn't ask him to expand on it. She looked at Clara and Eli, who were watching Rhett with the wary stillness of children assessing an unfamiliar adult. He looked back at them, and something moved through his expression, something quick and bleak that he got under control almost immediately. "Yours?" he said to Elira, meaning was she taking responsibility for them? "Yes," she said. She hadn't decided it until she said it. He nodded, no argument. He looked at the fort. They'll organize in another 10 minutes. We need distance. She stood. Clara stood. Elira took Eli by the hand on one side, and Rhett took the boy's other hand without ceremony, and they went north through the dark toward the horses, moving as fast as 4 people. One of them, an infant, one of them 3 years old, could reasonably move across frozen Wyoming ground before dawn. It was not fast enough to be comfortable. It was fast enough to matter. They reached the horses before the fort fully woke up. Rhett untied them with hands that moved faster than his face suggested anything urgent was happening, and he lifted Eli onto the saddle of the pack horse before the boy had time to object, which would have been the wrong moment for an objection. Clara climbed up behind without being asked. Elira was already mounted with Nate against her chest, one arm locked around him, the other hand on the reins, and she looked at Rhett, and he looked at her, and they went north at a pace that the terrain barely allowed and the situation absolutely demanded. Behind them, maybe a mile back, she could see lantern light moving at the fort's east entrance. Organized now. Not running yet, but deliberate. And deliberate men with horses and a direction were not nothing. Rhett rode ahead, reading the ground, picking the line through the dark with the instinct of someone who'd been doing it long enough that it had become reflex. He cut east when she expected north, then north when she expected east, threading them through a series of shallow draws that weren't on Hollenbeck's map and that she suspected existed in Rhett's memory the way all the important things in his life appeared to exist there, quietly, without announcement, available when needed. She focused on the riding, on keeping Nate steady, on the sound of the horses behind her carrying the children. Clara was riding well, better than Elira had expected from a 5-year-old, though she was beginning to recalibrate her expectations of Clara generally. Eli had both hands in the mane of the pack horse, and his eyes were wide and his mouth was pressed into a line that was either terror or excitement, and she suspected it was both, the way it usually is at 3 years old when the distinction hasn't fully developed. They rode for 2 hours before Rhett slowed them to a walk. He came back alongside her and looked behind them, both of them looking, both scanning the dark for moving lights. And there was nothing. The draws had done their work. Whatever men had come out of the fort, they'd either gone the wrong direction or decided in the cold pre-dawn darkness that the value of the pursuit didn't outweigh the misery of it. "We lost them," she said. "For now." He kept his eyes on the dark. "They'll regroup at daylight and pick up the trail. We need distance, not rest." "How far to Hollenbeck's?" "The way we need to go to stay off the main routes. 2 days." He looked at her, at Nate. "There's a line shack about 3 hours north, abandoned. We stop there, get the children warm, eat something, move again by noon." She nodded. He fell back to check on Clara and Eli, and she heard him speaking to them in a low, plain voice. Not baby talk, not the particular condescension that many adults aimed at children, just the same direct economy he used with everyone, scaled down in volume. She heard Clara answer him in that careful, watchful way she had, and heard Eli ask a question about whether the pack horse had a name. "Doesn't have one," Rhett said. A pause. "Why not?" "Never needed one." "He probably wants one," Eli said, with great confidence. There was a brief silence that might have contained Rhett working out how to respond to this. "What would you call him?" Eli considered it with the seriousness the question deserved. "Brown," he said finally. Another pause. "His name is Brown," Rhett confirmed, and moved back up to the front. Elira's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. The line shack was exactly what it sounded like. 1 room, dirt floor, a small iron stove that Rhett had going in under 10 minutes with wood stacked against the outside wall by whoever had last used it, and no other virtues to speak of. But it was out of the wind and it held heat, and Elira sat against the wall with Nate at her chest and let the warmth work on her and felt about 4 separate parts of her body lodge formal complaints about the last several hours that she promised to address eventually. Clara and Eli ate without talking, which told her how tired they were. Eli fell asleep sitting up, mid-chew, in the matter-of-fact way of very young children, and Clara lowered him carefully to the floor and put her own coat over him and sat against the wall with her knees pulled up, watching the stove. Rhett was at the stove, his back to the room, and for a while the only sound was the fire and the wind outside and Nate's small breathing. "You went back," Elira said. Not an accusation, just something she'd been turning over. He looked at her over his shoulder. "After the main building," she said. "There was time between the shots I heard and when you came through the dark. You went back for something." He was quiet for a moment. There was a man in the records room. Devers. He wasn't. I didn't go there looking for that. He turned back to the stove, adjusted the damper. He was going to get to the ledger before me. Burn it. A pause. He knew what it was worth. She waited. He made a choice, Rhett said. Flat. Final. Not a good one. She sat with that. This was the part of the story that didn't get cleaned up, she understood. The part that lives in the unlit corner, and that you know is there, and that you build the rest of your life around without ever quite looking directly at. She'd known from the first day, from the moment she'd gotten on his horse in the yard at Clearwater Hollow, that this man occupied territory she didn't, had done things she couldn't, and he wouldn't inventory for her. She'd accepted that as the arithmetic of the situation. She still accepted it. What mattered was the ledger on the floor beside him, thick and dark-covered and full of names and routes and transactions, and the 4 people in this shack who were alive and warm. How many names are in it? She asked. Enough. He sat down on the floor opposite the stove. Buyers, facilitators, transit routes, dates. He put his hand on the cover. The syndicate didn't just move children, adults too. The whole operation. Sutter was running it for Harlan directly, not as a side arrangement. It goes to the top. She looked at the ledger. Harlan, she said. Jonas Harlan. You know the name. Everyone in the territory knows the name. He owns half the cattle operations between here and the Dakotas. He employs 2 judges and a territorial senator. She paused. How does Greer move against someone like that? Carefully. Rhett looked at the fire through the stove grate. And with evidence that makes it impossible not to, even for men who'd rather look the other way. He looked at the ledger again. That's what this is. She thought about what Mabel had told her back in Clearwater Hollow's boarding house on a morning that felt both recent and geological in its distance. They've been doing more than cattle for the last few years. Moving people. Children especially. She thought about the Norton girl Mabel had mentioned, and whether that girl's name was in the ledger, and where she was now. She looked at Clara asleep against the wall, with her arm around Eli. I want to see it, she said. The ledger. When we're somewhere stable. Rhett looked at her. Why? Because my name is probably in it. Whatever Krause arranged, whatever Pell was, they were part of this operation. The transaction in that yard was part of this. She met his eyes. I want to see it. He held her gaze for a long moment. It'll be worse than you're expecting. I know. People you might recognize, from Clearwater Hollow, from... I know, Rhett. He nodded once. No further argument. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing against the shack's walls with the low, sustained pressure of a thing that intends to outlast you. Nate shifted in her arms and made a small, disgruntled sound, and she moved him and he settled. Rhett watched this. The adjustment, the settling, with an expression she couldn't fully decode. There was something in it that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite its opposite, something more like the face of a man watching a thing that costs him to look at for reasons he hasn't shared. When you find Lily, Elira said. She kept her voice quiet. Whatever the situation is in Cheyenne, she's going to need time. You know that. I know. She may be... She chose her words. 4 years is most of her life. She may be attached to those people, the Carvers. She may not understand at first why... I know, he said again, and this time there was something in it that closed the subject, not unkindly but firmly, the way you close a door on a room you're not ready to enter. She left it. They slept in shifts. Rhett took first watch, sitting by the stove with his rifle across his knees, and Elira slept with Nate on the floor beside Clara and Eli, 4 bodies generating enough shared warmth to make the night survivable, which was all nights asked for, and sometimes all they offered. She woke to gray pre-dawn light with Rhett's hand on her shoulder, light and brief, the way you'd wake someone you were trying not to startle. She was on her feet with Nate in her arms before she was fully conscious, which she noted with some detached awareness was a new thing about herself. The speed of the transition from asleep to upright, the way her body had reorganized its priorities since the yard in Clearwater Hollow. They were moving by first light. The second day of riding was harder than the first, in the specific way that second days are always harder. The initial adrenaline metabolized, the body presenting the bill for what was spent. Her midsection had started hurting again, a deep, specific ache that she diagnosed as probably not dangerous and definitely not comfortable, and she shifted her weight in the saddle and breathed through it and kept moving. Claire rode better in daylight than in dark, sitting straighter on Rhett's horse, watching the terrain pass with the alert eyes of a child who had learned to pay attention to geography. Eli had named 3 more things by mid-morning. A rock formation was Harold, a cluster of pines was them, a creek they crossed was simply and firmly the water, and Rhett had confirmed each designation without inflection. They stopped at noon by a creek that Eli had not yet named. Rhett watered the horses while Elira sat on a rock and ate, and let her legs be grateful for the pause. Clara walked the creek edge, picking up stones, examining them with scientific seriousness, discarding most and keeping 2. Eli followed her with the trusting persistence of someone for whom his sister was the primary authority on all matters. "Where did you come from?" Elira asked Clara when she came back with her stones. "Before the fort. Where's home?" Clara turned a stone over in her hand. It was smooth and pale gray, probably quartz. "Kansas," she said. "We had a farm." She said it the way people say things that are true and also gone. "Mama died in the summer. Then some men came." She turned the stone again. "They said they were taking us to relatives." Elira sat with that. "You knew they weren't," she said. "I knew pretty fast." Clara looked at the stone. Eli didn't. He still thought. She stopped, glanced at her brother, who was crouching at the creek edge, putting his hand in the water and pulling it back out immediately with deep satisfaction. "I didn't tell him what I thought. Seemed better." 5 years old, and she'd been managing her brother's terror by managing her own, on top of everything else. Elira thought about what kind of child she'd been at 5, mostly concerned with whether the barn cat would let her hold it and what was for supper, and felt the comparison like a small blow to the sternum. "You did good," Elira said. "By him. You did everything right." Clara looked at her with those careful, old young eyes. "Nobody came for a long time," she said. "I know. I thought—" She stopped again. Something moved through her face that was there and gone before Elira could fully read it. "I thought nobody was going to." Elira looked at her directly. "I came." "You came for your baby." "I came," Elira said, "and you were there, and I took you with me. That's not a small thing, Clara. That's not nothing." Clara turned the stone over and over. "Are you going to keep us?" she said, quiet and direct, the way children ask the questions adults dance around. Elira held her gaze. "As long as you need a place to be." Clara turned the stone one more time. Then she put it in her pocket. Rhett had heard this from the horses. She could tell by the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of someone listening carefully while appearing not to. He finished with the cinch, led the horses over, and said nothing about any of it. They reached Hollenbeck's at dusk on the second day. Mako was outside before they'd fully dismounted, assessing, and her eyes went first to Elira's face, and then to Nate, and then to the 2 children climbing down from the horses with the stiff, careful movements of people who had been riding longer than their bodies were designed for. She looked at Rhett last, at the torn coat and the ledger under his arm, and the expression he was wearing, and she said simply, "Everyone's alive," in the tone of someone marking a column. "Everyone's alive," Rhett confirmed. Inside there was heat and food, and Hollenbeck's large, practical competence applied to the situation of feeding 4 people in various states of cold and exhaustion. Clara and Eli were given soup and installed near the fire, and Clara fell asleep upright again, her bowl half finished, and Eli stayed awake long enough to ask Hollenbeck if his horse had a name, and when told it did, asked what it was. And when told it was Sadie, he nodded with the satisfaction of someone who finds the world in better order than expected, and then also fell asleep. Rhett put the ledger on the table in front of Hollenbeck. The old man looked at it without touching it for a moment. "That what I think it is?" "Sutter's records. Everything." Hollenbeck sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling briefly, with the expression of a man doing private arithmetic. "Jonas Harlan is in there. Near the back, 3 years of transactions that lead directly to him. You take this to Greer, there are people who will want to make sure neither of you arrive." Hollenbeck said it plainly, without drama, just information. "I know. You'll need an escort, or speed, or both." Hollenbeck looked at the ledger again. "I know a man in Rollins who owes me more than I've asked for. He can ride, and he's not affiliated with anyone in that book." He tapped the table. "Give me the morning to send word." Rhett looked at Elira across the table. She looked back at him. "The morning," she said. She found him later outside, standing at the corral fence looking at the dark. She'd settled Nate with Maka, who had taken the baby with the efficient tenderness of someone who'd been waiting for the chance. And the night was cold but still, the wind dropped, the stars doing what stars did, which was exist with complete indifference and considerable beauty. She stood beside him at the fence. "I looked at it," she said. She'd taken the ledger into the back room for an hour while the children slept. She'd kept her word to herself, and she'd read what was in it. "My name is in there. The transaction from Clearwater Hollow. Kraus, Pell, the amounts, the dates." She looked at the fence post. 3 other women from the Hollow in the last 2 years, names I recognize. She paused. "The Norton girl Mabel told me about. She's listed too." Rhett was quiet. "I found her," Alera said. "A buyer in Colorado. A family name." Her voice was steady, but it cost something to keep it that way. "She's 5 now. If the situation is what the ledger suggests, people who couldn't have children, people who paid for the appearance of something legitimate, she may be in a household that's not. She may not be in danger." "Greer will investigate every name," Rhett said. "He needs to. All of them." She looked at the stars. "That's the thing about a ledger. It doesn't let you look away. Every transaction is just sitting there, named and dated, waiting for someone to decide it matters." "It matters," he said. "I know it does." She turned to look at his profile in the dark. The whole network falls if this reaches Greer intact. Not just Sutter, not just Kraus. The judges, the transit men, the buyers who knew. All of it. He turned his head and looked at her. "We get it there," he said. Not a question. A decision, stated. "We get it there," she agreed. The corral was quiet. Brown, Eli's name, she realized, had apparently stuck, shifted his weight in the dark, and blew out through his nose. The comfortable sound of an animal at rest with no particular opinion about the humans nearby and their complicated problems. She was tired in a way that had settled into her permanently over the last week. Something that wasn't just physical, but structural. The kind of tired that comes from having the entire framework of your life dismantled and rebuilt in a short period of time. She suspected it would be with her for a while. She suspected there were things she hadn't processed yet and wouldn't until she had space to, until the immediate urgencies resolved themselves enough that the quieter damage could surface. She was okay with that. She was familiar with the mechanism. You kept moving while you had to move, and you dealt with what you'd been carrying when you could put it down. For now, she had Nate. She had Clara and Eli. She had a ledger that was going to Laramie if she had to write it there herself. She had a man standing beside her at a fence in the dark who had bought her out of a yard and was deeply imperfect and had lost something in that fort she'd never asked him to account for, and who had, in the last week, shown her more reliable honesty than anyone she could name from the previous 2 years of her life. It wasn't everything. It was enough to build from. "Get some sleep," Rhett said. "Early start tomorrow." She pushed off the fence. "You should too." "I will." She looked at him. He was looking at the dark again, and his face had the nighttime quality she'd noticed before, less guarded slightly in the dark than in the day, as though the absence of being seen made it possible to let the features settle into something closer to what was actually there. She went inside. She didn't sleep immediately. She lay on the floor near Nate's makeshift cradle and listened to the sounds of the house. Maka breathing, somewhere the children shifted, the fire settling. And she ran through the route to Laramie in her mind. The distances, the variables, the names in the ledger, and what they would mean when they landed on Greer's desk. She thought about the Norton girl in Colorado. She thought about Lily in Cheyenne. She thought about all the names she hadn't recognized in the ledger, the ones that were just names, lives she didn't know, people who were somewhere on the same side of this that she was, waiting for someone to decide it mattered. It mattered. Outside, the stars continued their indifferent business. The cold pressed against the walls. Inside, 4 people and 1 small new person breathed together in the dark. And morning was on its way, as it always was, whether you were ready for it or not. The ledger changed everything, and it did it slowly, the way real change usually works. Not a single moment, but a series of them, each one unremarkable until you looked back and realized the ground had shifted entirely beneath your feet. They made it back to Hollenbeck's with 4 horses, 3 children, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into the skeleton and stays there for days. Maka took one look at Elira when they rode in and said nothing, just took Nate from her arms and began checking him over with efficient, careful hands, while Elira sat down on the porch step and stayed there for a while. Not because she chose to, but because her legs had decided the conversation was over. Clara and Eli stood in the yard, close together, Clara's hand on her brother's shoulder, both of them watching everything with the particular alertness of children who've learned that the relative safety of one moment doesn't predict the next. Hollenbeck came out and looked at them and looked at Rhett, and Rhett said quietly, "They need a few days." And Hollenbeck nodded and went back inside and came out with bread and dried fruit, which he delivered to the children without ceremony or excessive kindness. Just set it in front of them like it was a normal thing on a normal morning. It was exactly the right approach. Clara took it and divided it with her brother and ate without lowering her guard, which was also exactly right. Rhett sat at Hollenbeck's table that evening with the ledger open in front of him, and he went through it with the slow, careful attention of a man who has been waiting 4 years for this specific kind of information and is making himself read it correctly rather than the way he wants to. Illyra sat across from him. She had Nate at her chest, nursing, finally, for the first time. That part of her body at least still knew what it was supposed to do, even after everything, and she was more grateful for this than she could have put into words. She watched Rhett's face as he read. He was 3/4 through the ledger when he stopped. He didn't move for a long moment. His finger was on a page, on a line, and his jaw had a tension in it that she recognized now. The specific set of his jaw when something was costing him and he wasn't going to show how much. She waited. "She's alive," he said. His voice came out level, but with something underneath that flatness, something pressurized. "Lily. She was moved south in the spring 3 years ago, sold to a family named Carver, Cheyenne." He looked up, and his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen them do before. The same thing as his voice, controlled on the surface. But the control was taking visible effort. "She's alive." Illyra let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for him. "Cheyenne's not far," she said carefully. "No." He looked back down at the page, stayed there. "No, it's not." She didn't say anything else. There was a version of this where she offered something. Comfort, reassurance, the kind of words people produce in moments like this, but she'd learned in the last several days that Rhett Calder received comfort the way he received most things that weren't practical information, politely, distantly, without really letting it land. What he needed right now was not someone talking at him. She knew this because she'd needed the same thing too many times herself. So she held Nate and let the silence be what it was, and Rhett sat with his daughter's name on a page in a stolen ledger, and the fire burned. And outside Hollenbeck told the children a story in a low, rambling voice that eventually slowed and stopped, which meant the children had fallen asleep, which was the best possible outcome. After a while, Rhett closed the ledger. "The other names in here," he said. "The buyers. The roots." He looked at the cover. "This isn't just Sutter. This is the whole network. Everyone who paid. Everyone who facilitated." His voice had gone back to flat, but it was a different kind of flat now. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something cold and decided. "There's a federal marshal in Laramie, name of Greer. He's the only one in the territory I know for certain isn't in the syndicate's pocket." "How do you know?" "Because they tried to buy him 2 years ago, and he threw the man out of his office and reported it. And the man disappeared shortly after, which should have ended Greer's career and didn't. Because even corrupt territorial officials understood that a dead federal marshal brings the kind of attention nobody wants." He put his hand on the ledger. "This goes to Greer, the whole thing." Illyra looked at him. "Kraus is in there?" "Kraus. The 2 traders from Billings, the judge who signed the paperwork that made their operation look legal." He paused. "Pell. The man with the pleasant face who'd stood in the yard at Clearwater Hollow and offered $50 for her like he was haggling over a saddle. "Good," she said. They rode to Laramie 4 days later when Illyra could sit a horse for more than an hour without her body staging a formal protest. Maka had made her swear to rest, had given her more of the herb pouch, had looked her in the eye with the specific expression of someone who knows their instructions are going to be followed imperfectly, but is trying anyway. Illyra had made the swear and meant most of it. The children came with them. There was no one to leave them with, and no question of leaving them. Illyra had said yes in that hollow in the dark outside the fort, and she was not a person who unmade those kinds of decisions. Clara sat behind Rhett on his horse, rigid with the effort of appearing unafraid, and Eli sat in front of Illyra with Nate, which was an arrangement Illyra had some logistical concerns about, but which ended up working because Eli treated the baby with a gravity and seriousness that no 3-year-old should naturally possess, but which was, she was learning, just who Eli was. "He's small," Eli said, looking at Nate on the first day of riding. "He is," Illyra agreed. "He's new." Eli considered this. Will he get bigger? He will. How long? Years. Eli seemed to find this timeline reasonable and returned to watching the trail. Marshall Greer was a narrow, gray man in his late 50s who looked like he'd been carved from the same stone as the Laramie Range, and who regarded the ledger Rhett laid on his desk with the expression of someone who has suspected a thing for a long time and is not particularly pleased to be proven right. He looked through it for a long time. Nobody spoke. "This is Harlan Syndicate business," he said finally. Not a question. "From one end to the other," Rhett said. Greer turned a page, turned another. His face stayed flat, but his eyes were doing the work, moving fast, cataloging. "Names in here I didn't expect." He tapped one page without specifying which. "Names I very much did expect." He closed it and put his hand on the cover, the same way Rhett had, and looked across the desk. "How'd you get it?" "Better you don't know that part." Greer looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man performing a calculation. "The fort at Bitter Creek." "Better you don't know." "There are men missing from that fort," Greer said. "I've had word this morning. People are asking questions. People in the Syndicate's pocket. Some of them." Greer looked at Elira, at the infant against her chest, at Clara and Eli standing near the wall. He looked at Rhett. Something moved through his expression that might have been the seed of respect, or might have been the resignation of a man who sees a situation clearly and doesn't love any of his options. "The woman sold in Clearwater Hollow," he said. "Week ago. I heard about that." "You heard about it and you didn't—" Elira started. "I heard about it 3 days after," Greer said, evenly meeting her eyes, "by which time you were already gone." He held her gaze. "I've been building a case on the Syndicate for 2 years. No federal support, no territorial backing that I trusted, no leverage." He looked at the ledger. "Until now." She looked at him for a long moment. "How many children are in that ledger?" she asked. Greer glanced at it. "I haven't finished counting. More than 40 transactions that I've seen." 40. More than 40. She held Nate tighter, without meaning to, and made herself breathe. "Then use it," she said. He did. What happened next took weeks, and it was not clean, and it was not swift, and anyone expecting the machinery of justice to move with the speed and moral clarity of a story told around a fire would have been disappointed. It ground, is what it did. It ground slowly and unevenly, and with the infuriating persistence of a system that was half broken but not fully broken, staffed by men who were variously corrupt, cowardly, occasionally decent, and in Greer's case, stubbornly functional in the way of people who've stopped expecting the world to cooperate and have decided to proceed anyway. Krause was arrested in Clearwater Hollow on a Tuesday morning in December, and the town watched it happen from behind their windows and their careful expressions, and most of them felt something that was probably relief and that they were too practiced at not seeing to immediately recognize as such. The 2 traders from Billings were picked up separately, days apart, which was less satisfying but legally sufficient. The judge, the one who'd signed the paperwork, had the case against him disappear twice through court channels that Greer traced back to men who then had their own cases opened. It was slow. It worked. Pell ran. He got as far as the Montana border before a federal deputy who owed Greer a significant personal favor caught up with him outside a trading post near Bozeman. The pleasant expression, by all accounts, had not survived the experience of being caught. Sutter was harder. Sutter had known something was wrong from the night of the fort, had moved fast and gone deep, and the Syndicate's upper levels had evidently decided he was more dangerous to them as a loose end than as an asset, and had withdrawn their protection. He ran without backing, which made him desperate, which made him stupid in the particular way that cornered people become stupid. Greer's deputy found him in February, hiding in a livestock barn outside of Rawlins, and he was arrested without the dramatic confrontation that he'd perhaps spent weeks dreading, which was its own kind of justice. The anticlimactic, unglamorous justice of a man found cold and frightened in a barn and handcuffed and put in a wagon, which is exactly what he deserved, and not one bit more. Elira wasn't there for any of these arrests. She was at the ranch. Rhett's ranch sat on the eastern face of a low ridge above a creek that ran clear even in winter, and it was not a romantic place. It was a working property that looked like what it was, which was years of one man's labor applied to land that rewarded effort grudgingly and on its own terms. The main house was solid but plain, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen built for function. The barn was in better repair than the house, which told you something about Rhett's priorities. The view from the front step was mountains and sky, and nothing else for as far as you could see in 3 directions, which was either beautiful or oppressive depending on your mood and whether you'd had enough sleep. Elira had arrived there with the children on a gray afternoon in late November, following Rhett up the last half-mile of trail that wound up the ridge, and she'd stood on the front step and looked at the view and thought, "This is manageable. Not beautiful, not home, not yet either of those things, but manageable," which was where she was operating from. The first week was logistical. Clara and Eli needed beds, clothing, food, a routine that wasn't built around fear. Clara needed a different kind of attention. She was old enough to understand what had happened to her and young enough to not have the vocabulary for it, which meant it came out sideways, in silences and sudden flinching, and the particular hypervigilance that Elira recognized because she was running a milder version of it herself. She didn't push. She made the days predictable, which is the only real medicine for that kind of wound, and she let Clara move at her own pace, and she did not make the mistake of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't, because Clara was too sharp for that, and it would have cost trust that Elira couldn't afford to lose. Rhett was Rhett. He went about the ranch work with the same economy of movement and word that characterized everything he did, and he treated the children the way he treated most things that required his care, without sentiment, with reliability. He showed Eli how to feed the horses. He fixed the split in Clara's boot without being asked because he'd noticed her limping. He did not try to be warm, and he was not cold. He was simply present in the way that some people manage to be present, actually there, actually paying attention, even when he was saying nothing. Elira watched him with Clara one afternoon, about 2 weeks in. He was splitting firewood, and Clara had drifted out to the yard, the way she'd started doing, pulling toward people without quite committing to proximity. She stood 10 feet away and watched him work. He split 3 logs before he said, without looking up, "You can stack if you want." Clara looked at the growing pile. "I don't have to," he said. "Just if you want something to do." She walked over and started stacking. They worked in silence for a while, him splitting, her stacking, and Elira watched from the window and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't examine too closely because she was still, in many ways, in the middle of her own recovery and didn't fully trust her own readings on things. He left for Cheyenne in the first week of December. He told her the night before, matter of fact, "I'm going to Cheyenne. Shouldn't be more than 2 weeks. To find Lily. To find where the Carver family is. Find out the situation." He was at the table, not looking at her. "It's been 4 years. She won't know me." Elira sat down across from him. He was staring at the table surface with the expression she'd come to recognize as what happened when his control over his own face required active maintenance. "She's 6, Elira said. "I know how old she is. I mean..." She paused, choosing. Children that age are resilient in ways that aren't always visible right away. She may not know you, but that doesn't mean she can't come too. The Carver family might not. Let her go. I know. She looked at him. But you have the ledger evidence. Greer has the case. Whatever arrangement those people made, it was made through Sutter's network. It's not legal. It was never legal. She kept her voice steady. You have grounds, Rhett. He was quiet for a moment. What if she doesn't want to come? He said. Very quietly. What if she's been there long enough that she... Then you take it slow, Elira said. Then you give her time. Then you show up consistently until she understands that you're not going away. She paused. That's all any of us can do. He looked at her then, held her gaze for a long moment in that way he had, as if measuring something. You've been doing that, he said, with Clara. I've been trying to. He nodded, slowly. You're good at it. She hadn't expected that. Coming from him, in that flat, undecorated tone, it landed differently than praise usually did, without performance, without the intention to make her feel something. Just an observation, just the truth as he saw it. Thank you, she said. He came back from Cheyenne in 11 days. He came back with Lily. She was a small girl, dark-haired like him, but with her mother's features, apparently, Elira had no way to know, with a serious face and the same close-set brown eyes, and the grave, watchful quality of a child who'd been in an unfamiliar situation for long enough that careful observation had become second nature. She held Rhett's hand on the walk up from the horses, and she looked at everything with that watchful seriousness, and she said very little. The Carvers had not fought it. When Greer's documentation arrived ahead of Rhett and a federal deputy showed them the paperwork, they had, according to Rhett's brief account, said very little and returned the girl with what appeared to be actual relief. People who had perhaps made a purchase in desperation and spent 4 years understanding it had been a mistake, and hadn't known how to undo it. Whether that made them better or worse than the people who'd had no such doubts, Alira didn't know, and she decided it wasn't her question to answer. Lily stood in the middle of the main room and looked around at this place that was supposed to be home to her, and at these people who were supposed to be what exactly? And then her eyes landed on Nate, lying on his back on a blanket near the fire, doing what 6-week-old babies do, which is move their arms and legs and look at the middle distance with profound concentration. "What's that?" Lily said. "That's Nate," Alira said. "He's about 6 weeks old." Lily looked at him for a long time. "He doesn't do much." "Not yet." "When will he?" "Few months for most things. Years for the interesting parts." Lily considered this, then she sat down near the blanket, at a careful distance, and watched him. Her posture had the particular quality of a child who is trying not to look like she's interested and is not entirely succeeding. Rhett stood near the door and looked at his daughter sitting by the fire, and Alira was standing near enough that she could see his face, and she watched it do something that his face very rarely did. It stopped. Just stopped. All the control and the blankness and the architecture of careful distance just fell away for one unguarded second, and what was underneath was nothing complicated. It was a man looking at a thing he had not let himself believe he'd see again, and it was the kind of scene that sits below the level of words. He cleared his throat and found something to look at that wasn't his daughter. Alira moved to the kitchen and put more water on. Winter deepened around the ranch in the way Wyoming winter does. Not dramatically, but absolutely, turning the world outside the windows into something monochrome and still. The ranch had its rhythms, the morning feeding, the fire maintenance, the meals, the repairs that the cold kept generating. Rhett was teaching Clara the horses in earnest now, because she'd shown she had the patience for them, and Clara was teaching Eli some game she'd invented that involved colored stones and rules that changed apparently at her discretion. And Lily had claimed the blanket near Nate as something close to her own territory and spent parts of every day there, providing the baby with a running and largely one-sided commentary on her observations about their shared situation. "You don't understand any of this," Lily told him one afternoon with great seriousness. "But that's okay. I'm going to explain it again later." Nate looked at the ceiling. Alira, at the kitchen table with Maka's herb instructions spread out in front of her. She was learning slowly what Maka had been willing to teach during the recovery days, heard this and looked over and caught Rhett's expression from across the room. He'd heard it too. The look that passed between them was not a look that required naming. It was just the look of two people who have been through something genuinely terrible together and have come out the other side into something that is not yet easy but is real, and who have enough sense to recognize that for what it is. Things that were not fixed. Clara still woke up some nights from dreams she wouldn't describe. Alira still had days when the weight of what had been done to her, sold in a yard-like property, stripped of her child in the first minutes of his life, sat on her chest like a stone and wouldn't move until she made herself move it. Rhett still had silences that were too deep to be called ordinary quiet, and he still didn't know how to accept comfort, and probably never would, not entirely. Lily still didn't call him anything, not Papa, not his name, not anything. She just started sentences and left the address out, which he noticed and said nothing about. Things that were true. They were here. The children were fed and warm. Nate was growing with the single-minded purpose of someone who has decided they have a great deal of catching up to do. The ledger had done its work, and across the territory the syndicate's network was collapsing in stages, each arrest pulling the next thread, the way these structures always eventually come apart when someone takes the first one seriously. Things that were beginning. In February, a letter arrived from Greer. Clara and Eli had a grandmother in Kansas who'd been looking for them since the previous spring. She was alive and able, and Greer had contacted her. She would come in March, if the family at the ranch was willing, to meet her grandchildren. Alira read the letter twice and then gave it to Clara. Clara read it once and looked up with an expression Alira hadn't seen on her before. Not the watchfulness, not the careful composure, but something raw and young and almost frightened, which was closer to hope than anything else, and also harder to manage. "She's really alive?" Clara said, according to the marshal. Clara looked at the letter again. Eli was pulling at her sleeve and she showed him, though he couldn't read, and explained it to him in a low voice in the way she explained most things to him, carefully, with more patience than most adults could have managed. He processed it and then said, "Do we know her?" And Clara said, "No, but we will," and put her arm around him. Alira left them to it. The morning of the first real thaw, late March, The kind of morning where the air smells like the earth remembering that it exists. Elira was on the front step with Nate when Rhett came out and stood beside her. He'd been to Laramie the previous week for Sutter's sentencing, which had been everything legal proceedings are. Slow, procedural, unsatisfying in its mundane thoroughness, and entirely necessary. He'd come back quieter than usual, if that was possible, and had spent 2 days in the barn doing things that he declined to specify, which was his way of processing things, and she'd stopped fighting it. They stood and looked at the view that was still mountains and sky and nothing else for miles. "Lily called me Pa," he said. "Yesterday. She probably didn't mean to. She was talking fast and it just came out." "What did you do?" "Nothing. Kept talking. Didn't make a thing of it." A pause. "Seemed like the right call." It was. They stood there in the thin spring sun. "This isn't what I planned," Elira said. Not as a complaint, just as an observation, an acknowledgement of the distance between the life she'd mapped out and whatever this was. "No," Rhett agreed. "I didn't plan to be in Wyoming at all." She looked at Nate, who was blinking at the sky with the solemn attention he gave to most things currently. "Thomas was going to strike rich in the silver trade, and we were going to have a house in Denver by spring. How'd that work out?" She gave him a look. He might have almost smiled. It was brief and one-sided, and entirely possible she imagined it. "What did you plan?" she asked. He thought about it. "To find Lily." He paused. "That was the whole plan by the end. Didn't think past it." He looked out at the mountains. "Didn't let myself." "And now you're past it." "And now I'm past it." She shifted Nate to her other shoulder. He made a small sound of mild protest at the disruption and then settled. "We should put up a second bedroom before winter," she said. "Lily and Clara can't share the corner space forever. They'll start driving each other crazy by fall." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking the same thing." "I can help with the framing. I'm not useless at construction." "I didn't think you were." He paused. "I'll start the timber next month." That was how they did it, she was learning. Not large declarations, not the kind of explicit conversations that required things to be named. Just the slow accumulation of practical decisions. Another room, a shared meal, a look across a room, that added up to something neither of them would have had the language for even if they'd been inclined to try. She was not naive about what this was or wasn't. It was not a clean ending. Nothing that came before it had been clean, and she didn't believe in clean endings. She believed in the next day and the one after that, believed in showing up, believed in the specific courage of the ordinary, which is what most courage actually is when you strip the story down to what happened and what people did in response. She had been sold in a yard. She was here. Her son was alive and growing and currently attempting to fit his entire fist into his mouth with the determination of someone who has identified a problem and is committed to solving it. The mountains were still there, same as ever, indifferent to all of it, and somehow a comfort anyway. The permanence of the landscape against which small human lives played out their entire weight, their grief and their survival, and the stubborn, imperfect, necessary work of continuing. Nate grabbed her finger. She looked down at him. He looked back at her with those dark, serious eyes that she was increasingly certain were going to stay that color, and his grip on her finger was the grip of someone who has no idea what they've come into, but has decided, on available evidence, to hold on. She held on too. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.